Hello. Today we're looking at traveling with a person living with dementia. Whether you are a person who is currently living with dementia or whether you are caring for a person who's living with dementia, hopefully you'll find that there are a number of different tips and bits of information that can help make traveling more successful for either of you. This is me. My name is Lori Kelly. I am one of 3 program coordinators with our Programs and Services Department here at the Alzheimer's Society of BC. So there are a number of considerations when you are traveling together. It can be an enjoyable activity for both of you. There's no doubt that extra support, careful planning, and the right adjustments may be needed in order to maximize your chances of having a successful trip and minimizing travel-related stress. There's no doubt that traveling with a person who has dementia can present a number of challenges. We're going to look at some of the things to consider, including paying attention to some of the challenges, which can in fact be warning signs that perhaps the time of traveling is past. We are also going to look at some travel tips and finish up by looking at some alternatives to traveling. The goal is for you to come away with some strategies to help make the trip as enjoyable as possible for everyone involved. Many families and carers have happily and fulfilling trips, but know that you have to do a little extra planning. Generally, people living with dementia, particularly as the disease progresses, people generally do best in well-ordered, familiar, and stable settings. Everything that travel is not. So although that is the case, it's also true that travel can be successful with some thoughtful planning. Best always, well, not always. There's no always when you're living with dementia. But usually best to include the person living with dementia in the travel planning and have an open and frank discussion about the concerns that each of you may have and not have shared. Make sure that the person is included and that you discuss openly the itinerary and the speed of the itinerary. It is usually better to travel in the early stages of the illness, as later in the progress of the disease, the person may become disoriented, agitated, distressed with all of the changes that travel brings. It's important to recognize and prepare for the fact that a person living with dementia, their level of functioning may decrease during the trip due to unfamiliar environments and a change in routine. There's no doubt that no matter how wonderful travel or visiting is, for all of us, it is also a source of stress. Remember that the person living with dementia has less cognitive resilience, and therefore those stresses can hit them particularly hard. Planning ahead is critical. It's especially important to have a plan in case something happens to either one of you, and particularly in case something happens to the carer. So assess whether your person is still capable of traveling. And in order to do that, watch out for some of the challenges or warning signs that may be indicative of the fact that traveling is no longer a good idea. Consistent disorientation, agitation in familiar settings. Absolutely, we know that travel means a whole bunch of unfamiliar settings. So if someone living with dementia is beginning to experience agitation in familiar settings, traveling will only make that worse. So it's certainly something to be aware of. If they are wanting to go home after only a very short time away, one of the fellows shared in one of our support groups that he found it very, very challenging with his wife because both he and she really wanted to go and have dinner with their son. They did this every Sunday night. But what was happening is that they had barely got in the door, 5, 10 minutes maybe, and she was agitating to go home. They hadn't even had a chance for a pre-dinner chat, let alone actually eating dinner. And for her, she had reached the level of her tolerance. And for her, she thought the visit was done and she was ready to go home. So that would definitely have been a sign that if they were wanting to travel, perhaps the time had passed. You may notice that the person living with dementia, or if that's you, you may notice that it you become uh, stressed about or obsessed with upcoming events. So, for example, finding that the person is asking constantly, when are we leaving? Where are we going? What is it that we're doing? When are we leaving? What are we doing? And it can be a sign of agitation when those questions are repeated again and again and again. Obviously, because of the dementia, their short-term memory doesn't allow them to retain the fact that they've asked the question, or may not allow them to retain the fact. But it's the fact that it's being asked again and again tells you, as the carer, that something is bothering them and the questions are burbling up to the surface. So the more stressed they become over upcoming appointments, perhaps you've got a doctor's appointment on Friday, and find that you're best if you don't actually tell the person until Thursday or even maybe Friday morning. That can be a sign that is definitely would be a challenge when you're traveling. The other thing is getting teary or anxious or withdrawn in crowded, noisy settings. Even if the person with dementia is still able to travel, crowds and noisy settings can be very, very difficult. Watch for signs that your person may no longer feel as confident. Um, in one of our early stage groups, a fellow with dementia shared with me um, that he was no longer confident. He and his wife regularly went to Vegas and had been doing that for years. And he was embarrassed about the fact that he no longer felt confident when she would leave him on the street and she would say, "Oh, I'm just going to dash in here for a minute. You keep going and I'll catch up with you." That had been their pattern, and he was embarrassed to share with his wife that he was becoming frightened when she left him. And so if she had been watching carefully, she probably could have picked up on his body language or in his voice that that was no longer a comfortable thing for him. Difficult change for her as well. Further warning signs, prob- problems with managing continence. It isn't uncommon as many of the dementias progress to begin experiencing trouble with continence. And that can definitely add a challenge to traveling. If you notice agitated or wandering behavior, that is the need to get out and walk or just to leave where they are. Um, that increases the risks when you're traveling. Delusional, paranoid, responsive, or disinhibited behavior. All of those things will obviously add challenge to traveling and may be a good sign that it's time to think about some alternatives. If any of these signs are present, as I said, it may mean that travel is not a good idea. If the travel is unavoidable, it would be advisable to consult a specialist, geriatrician, your family doctor, to explore whether medications may be useful to help settle the person living with dementia. Providing a familiar and reassuring companion is the first consideration, so not sending someone living with dementia on their own somewhere, but making sure that they have a travel companion that they know. Even if none of the signs are present, it may still be useful to undertake a short trip as a trial, ideally using the same type of transportation as is planned for the longer trip, be it bus, a short boat ride, um, a flight perhaps from Vancouver to Victoria or Victoria to Nanaimo, somewhere that's short, but will allow you to test out the same kind of travel transport experience, and it'll give you a good idea as whether it's a good idea to continue to pursue the plan. There's a quote that we have from a caregiver that I really, really loved. There's no doubt that a lot of this is talking about the challenges and the considerations of traveling together. And it can sound a bit as though we're saying don't travel. That is absolutely not the case. And I love this quote for capturing that. I could honestly say with my husband, except for a few things that we laughed about later that were quite stressful in the moment, in many ways he loved his travel. And when he got back, he wouldn't remember everything about the trip, but he remembered some things. You have to be aware and try and think ahead and plan, but it was a really good experience in lots of ways. So I think it's important to keep that quote in mind as we continue to look at tips and still keeping those considerations in the back of your mind. So I've mentioned as a travel tip, taking a short trip ahead of time as a trial run, making sure that you have a contingency plan. Particularly consider if either of you gets sick or if you get separated. Learn as much as you can about the place that you'll be visiting so you can anticipate what you'll need. As much as possible, stick with the familiar. That can mean using hotels that you're like hotel chains, because often the bedrooms are set up exactly the same. It can mean using returning to places that you've been to before and with which the person living with dementia is familiar. It can even mean going to chain restaurants, which perhaps maybe you haven't in the past, but they're restaurants you go to at home that even that little touch of normalcy in a trip can help with agitation. Consider whether you might need to change the mode of travel. If you've always loved long car rides or RV trips, maybe it makes sense now to consider shortening the actual travel portion and flying to your destination. Or if perhaps you are the kind that is the trip itself is the most valuable part, then maybe consider a train trip instead of driving the car. You want to aim for as few changes in routine as possible. Keep it simple. This one's a little counterintuitive because it says avoid multiple stops or add longer stopovers. It really depends on the type of trip it is. What you want to avoid is one of those milk run plane rides where you're stopping every hour or two and perhaps dashing from one part of an airport to another to pick up the next leg of the flight. That only increases the chances of agitation and problems, and so ideally you want to avoid that. Conversely, if it's a really long trip, Vancouver to Australia, for example, you may want to consider breaking that into 2 or 3 legs, shorter legs and longer layovers, maybe a day or two in Hawaii, a couple of days in New Zealand. Um, I don't know the trip well enough to know the different spots, but wherever you're going, consider longer stopovers. If you're planning to drive, then again, consider driving for shorter periods of time and build stopovers in. Make sure you stop before dinner time, for example, and maybe do a quick walk after dinner and make sure to allow lots of time for rest. Be prepared to do everything for two. This is something that can be quite challenging for caregivers, especially if their travel companion has always truly been a partner. One of the things that dementia is likely to reduce is the person's ability to be a full partner in planning and executing all of the information and pieces that go into making a trip successful. It can be really tiring as well. So make sure you take lots of time to rest before the trip and that you build lots of rest breaks into the trip. A frequent comment we hear from people living with dementia is how tired they are. Anytime, if you have ever been to a conference, just sitting and listening to this webinar, anything where you have to listen to someone intently, you've probably had the experience of finding that you're exhausted at the end of a day of a conference. That is a good example of how living with dementia is. People find that they have to work hard to focus their brain and that it tires them, and so they're going to be tired. And then because you have to be thinking for two or may have to be thinking for two, you also are going to be tired, so make sure you have lots of time for rest. And consider, if possible, having an additional person travel with you. It can be huge help for the caregiver. It allows both of you to take a break from one another and allows the carer to not be quite so have to be on point all the time and can get some rest and enjoy the trip a bit themselves. You may find that it is a very worthwhile investment. Avoid traveling during peak season to reduce the chances of big crowds and travel delays. That may seem self-evident, but it's an important consideration. Avoid really elaborate sightseeing tours with lots and lots of stops. Again, you want to reduce, and reduce. Make it as simple as you can. So a tour that is perhaps mostly on a bus might work for someone who's comfortable sitting for long periods of time, or one that has a very relaxed pace. Ensure emergency health services are available if needed. So again, do some research on where you're going and where you're going to be and what kinds of emergency health services are going to be available. And again, as mentioned earlier, don't assume that things will be the same as they always have been just because functioning can decrease very unexpectedly and quite rapidly in a person living with dementia with all of the hustle and bustle of traveling. For example, don't assume that you can say to someone, in a busy airport, just wait here while you dash into the bathroom. Um, Simply because you've been able to do that all along. That is often a time when the person may forget very quickly that you've asked them to stay there. They're feeling nervous, concerned, agitated because of all of the noise and hustle and bustle, and they may well wander away. So that absolutely in airports and bus stations, train stations, that can be a common problem and is a way for people to easily get lost. So, what to bring with you? It's kind of like traveling um, with kids. Not in any way that a person living with dementia is childlike. But in the same way that if you're a parent, you may remember preparing for a whole variety of circumstances. In the same way, you want to have a bag with a bunch of essentials. Um, some people living with dementia may get quite agitated at particular times on a trip. For example, when everybody is boarding an airplane or filing onto a cruise ship, or during the takeoff and landings. So having noise canceling headset can be really helpful with some favorite music. It can help block out all that agitation and help the person to focus just and in the moment and enjoy the music. Um, Often having a change of clothes is really helpful. It's possible that um, unexpected incontinence can arise because of stress. And so being able to be prepared for a spill, for incontinence, for perhaps a fall, anything, just so that in the moment it can be very, that's okay, no worries. Look, we've got an extra shirt here, or we have an extra pair of pants. It's no worries. Just let it go. You want to reduce any additional agitation as much as possible. Make sure that you've got enough medication for the trip, and that's true for any travel, but it is especially true when traveling with a person living with dementia. Carry extra medications, enough for the trip, plus up to a week extra, depending on the length of the trip. And make sure that you've got snacks. Those can also be, I know for myself, I find them self-soothing, and so often both you and the person with dementia may enjoy having a favorite snack. The other thing to bring is identification. I'd really encourage you to encourage the person living with dementia to wear an identification bracelet at all times. And also make sure that the following information is in a familiar spot in either their purse, in a pocket, um, in their wallet if they're still carrying a wallet. Um, their name, your name, the name, address, and phone number of your holiday address, as well as any stopovers or the day's itinerary. Make sure you also have a recent photograph of the person living with dementia. When we see people every day, we may not be aware of what can be some fairly rapid physical changes. And a photo only a year or two old may not be helpful to someone who doesn't know your person living with dementia. Also, note details each day of what the person is wearing, as well as their preferred places of interest and any expected stops. That'll really help if a search is needed. Take a list of important contacts, such as your doctors. Make sure that you know their numbers and their emergency numbers in case you have to get a hold of them. Emergency contacts. Take copies of your power of attorney and representation agreement, and take a list of recent and current medications, That may be very, very helpful if either of you becomes unwell. And depending on whether it's a very long trip, you may even want to carry copies of your current prescriptions if your doctor will write additional prescriptions for you, especially if it's an extended or overseas trip. One of the things that can be very, very helpful is something called a courtesy card. And I encourage you to contact the Alzheimer's Society or our dementia helpline and ask for a copy of the courtesy cards. There are 6 different kinds. And you can, this is a picture of Jim Mann, and Jim says he often travels, even just around town, with the courtesy card in a lanyard around his neck. His says, "Please be patient. I have Alzheimer's disease." And he finds it very, very helpful when perhaps he gets rattled and no longer knows what change to put out. He puts it down, and the sign helps to explain if someone is feeling a little not feeling particularly patient. It does help. So we have 3 for people with dementia. I have memory problems, I have Alzheimer's disease, and I have dementia. And the ones for the caregivers are please be patient and compassionate. My companion has dementia, Alzheimer's, or memory problems. That can be very, very helpful. You also need to be the one, the caregiver needs to be the one to hold all important possessions such as passports, money, tickets, any schedules, any of that kind of thing. If, as a person living with dementia, you are upset by this, it's certainly, you can have copies. You can give your person living with dementia copies, but it's really wise if the main carer holds all of that information. It can also be really helpful to slip a courtesy card into the front of the passport so that you can discreetly give it to customs or other authorities if that situation arises. For many travelers with dementia and their companions, the most challenging part of the journey, as it is for anybody traveling, can be the airport, particularly the security checkpoints. Some travelers with dementia may have difficulty following instructions and responding to questions. We've heard stories of security staff separating the person with dementia from their travel companion, which for extra screening, which can really increase stress for both. A lanyard, like in the previous picture, but perhaps with a pocket in it, worn around the neck, can be a handy place to tuck away travel documents, making them easy to access when your hands are already full. Consider having the traveler with dementia have one of the courtesy cards in their lanyard as well, along with their passport, ticket, and identification for the security checkpoint. Book a flight that leaves at a quiet time of the day. For example, many airports are very busy between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. and between 4 p.m. and 7 p.m. It'll be a lot easier for you to find your way and to access assistance if you're traveling outside of those busy periods. Inform the airline. Let them know that you're traveling with a person with dementia. You may want to request early boarding, a wheelchair, transportation upon arrival, help getting on and off the plane, or with stowing carry-on baggage, any of those things. Don't hesitate to ask for help. Consider requesting seats close to the washroom. You can certainly often find information about the seating configuration of the exact airplane that you're going to be on and find the best seats for you. It may also be that your person living with dementia may appreciate being by the window to help limit overstimulation, or they may prefer being by the aisle so as to facilitate quick getting out if going to the washroom. You can choose what works best for you. You want to make sure that there's lots of activities to so that the person has choice. Often people living with dementia say that their period of concentration, their powers of concentration have been reduced, and their period of time that they're able to be engaged with any one activity is quite reduced. And so having a variety of things is helpful. Um, just having an inexpensive tablet that you can take traveling, you can load it with books, you can load it with music, you can magazines, games. One carer told us that they didn't expect it, but their dad was able to learn solitaire on a tablet very, very quickly and thoroughly enjoyed it, like not having to worry about the cards sliding around. My mom, who's 98 um, and is in residential care, recently was introduced to coloring books, which is something that I would never have thought to introduce to her. She loves it. And in fact, it's often something that we spend time doing together. That would be a great thing to take on travel. Remember that as I mentioned, many people with dementia have trouble concentrating. So you want to make sure that there's a variety of things. Ask for help. I mentioned in the previous slide, don't hesitate. The staff are there to help you. Probably one of the most important tips is to allow plenty of time. Travel tends to be quite scheduled, and we can certainly reduce the stress if we don't schedule too many things. Take time differences into account. You're going to need more time to adjust to a different time. Take lots of breaks. Plan for lots and lots, both rest breaks and just coffee breaks and time to just sit and recover some of that mental energy. Travel during the person's best time of day. We all have better times of day, but it's even more true for someone living with dementia. You'll know what is their best time of day, whether they're better early in the morning or just before noon. Often mid-afternoon for many people with dementia is a poor time, so that may be a good time to plan for rest breaks. It may seem odd, but it's important for you to, as the carer, to do regular comfort checks. That is, it isn't uncommon, particularly in a situation where they're feeling a little disoriented and out of sorts. Because they have lower cognitive resilience, they may not actually notice that the seatbelt is digging in and leaving a bruise, that kind of thing. They may be focused on other things. And so it's important that you be the one to actually do comfort checks, check on the seatbelt, that it's not too tight. Be alert and pay attention to body language so that you can recognize warning signs for anxiety and agitation. They'll be different for every person. For example, it could be repeated references to not going too far or asking how you're doing. Those can be signs that the person is beginning to feel anxious and uncomfortable. Encourage the person with dementia to wear an identification bracelet. I mentioned that. That's a safety issue. And you can record contact information on the bracelet or, as mentioned previously, in their wallet, purse, even in their pocket. Where possible, engage the safety lock in vehicles to prevent accidental opening of the car door. Be aware of the person's safety when parking, particularly if you're parking near traffic. And for you as the carer, a good safety tip is to note, don't get in the car if you're worried that the current stress and anxiety levels of the person living with dementia will impact your ability to drive safely and effectively. Some tips for staying in hotels. You can often look online for photos of the hotel room layout so that you can survey it ahead of time. Survey it for possible safety hazards. Inform staff. You may want to let the hotel know that you're traveling with a person living with dementia if they have any special needs. It can be really helpful to cover sliding glass doors to ensure the person living with dementia won't try to walk into the door. They may simply not see them. And it can also help to reduce the urge to wander. If staying in a hotel and wandering is a problem that you anticipate, lock the door to the room with a safety latch. You can get child-proof doorknobs. Some people may find that even more agitating. I recently just Googled portable door alarms and was surprised how many and how relatively inexpensive they are. Very, very easy to use. They go over the doorknob and have a small wire that goes to the door and is pulled. The connection is broken. Very, very simple. Be aware of anything unfamiliar. So, for example, unfamiliar taps in the bathroom may mean that you should be the one who's um, turning on the water or setting the shower temperature. That can be frustrating and it can be dangerous. And consider leaving the bathroom light on all night. If you're going to be meeting with family or friends, give them a heads up ahead of time about some of the changes that have happened. Any special needs that they have, like leaving the bathroom light on. Also, let your family and friends know how they can be helpful. And one of the best ways that they can be helpful is by spending time with the person living with dementia on their own so that the carer can get a break. And so can the person living with dementia. We talked in many of our early stage groups about how important it is for both of you to get a break from one another. And so it can be very, very helpful for family and friends to take the person on their own. The other thing to give them a heads up about is the need to be flexible in making plans, for them to keep those plans simple and be aware that those plans may need to change. The person may simply be too tired to go to another thing in the evening. And you want to stay as close to normal routine as possible. Try not to pack the day full with completely different things. If you're with family and friends, try and keep that daily routine as much as you can. Last tip about travel insurance. It may not be something that you've bought in the past, but it's certainly worthwhile considering now, particularly for flights and hotels, because travel plans may need to change. There may be a sudden change in the person living with dementia, and they may not be able to travel. And also shop around. Different insurers have different policies and premiums, and so you want to shop around and ask lots of questions. There will come a time, or I should say, there is likely to come a time when travel may become traumatic, is probably not too strong a word for both of you as the disease progresses. However, it can absolutely be difficult to decide not to continue traveling. We often hear, he just wants to go home one more time, from caregivers who feel that they really need to give that experience to their family member. And it's often true that it's also the caregiver who is reluctant to acknowledge the changes in their person. It's very important to be honest with yourself and as much as possible with one another. It may not be possible to have that one last trip. And you please acknowledge that if you do take one last trip, it may not be what you are hoping and expecting. Again, we've heard from many caregivers who've tried to go on one last trip and who've had poor experiences where the person living with dementia experiences greatly increased agitation, confusion. They may have no memories of the trip and generally a huge amount of stress for the caregiver. One wife told us of learning on a huge cruise ship, and she and her husband had done many, many cruises. But she felt that they wanted to go on one last cruise. She knew that were significant changes. And on the very first day, she discovered that even though her husband liked to follow her rather than lead the way, she had to ensure that he preceded her from elevators, because the very first day she got out of the elevator and turned around only to see the doors closing with him still in the elevator. And it took quite a while to reconnect with one another and was quite stressful for both of them. When overnight travel is no longer possible, absolutely both of you, people living with dementia and care partners, can very much be engaged in daily life and enjoy activities close to home. So think about some options. Staycations. Enjoy outings to favorite sites and restaurants, maybe places you haven't gone for a while. Picnic in the park. Go to a beach. Go to the ocean. Go to a lake. A day trip, just a nice drive. Have family and friends come to you instead of you go to them. And you can play tour guide. Plant a garden together. Often being outside and planting and being involved in the garden is something that both of you may really enjoy. Go through your pictures and stories from past trips and reminisce together. Again, you'll discover very quickly how many of the memories the person living with dementia has and whether they find that a frustrating or an enjoyable activity. Give it a try. You may find for both of you it's a lot of fun. So just to wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about some of the Alzheimer's Society of BC's other programs. We have resource centers located throughout the province. You can find a list of them on our website. Support groups, both support groups for caregivers and for people in the early stages. Minds in Motion is a weekly exercise and social program for people with early symptoms of dementia and a care partner. And this too is available in many communities around the province. And we have a whole variety of education workshops, webinars, recordings like this, and in-person workshops on a variety of topics along the dementia journey. We have a couple of series. Family Caregiver Series is a multi-session series designed for family caregivers. And Shaping the Journey, Living with Dementia is also a multi-session series, and it's again for people with dementia and a carer who want to explore how to live well with dementia. We also have a number of newsletters and bulletins. First Link Bulletin is, and I apology, this is wrong. It's First Link Bulletin is an listing of our education workshops in your area. Insight is an education bulletin for and by people living with dementia. And Connections is a quarterly publication. It's got resources for caregivers and also updates about the society. And you can find them on our website, alzheimerbc.org, where you found this link. You can call our dementia helpline and can connect to it there. 1-800-936-6033. I'm going to just leave this up for a bit. We periodically conduct program evaluation research. And the purpose of that kind of research is to strengthen our programs, to ensure that our programs are of the highest quality, and most importantly, that they're meeting the needs of the people who are receiving them. If you are interested in participating, visit alzbc.org. Just going to say here. So alzbc.org/FL-evaluation. So alzbc.org/FL-evaluation. That will allow you to share your contact information, and therefore it will allow you to give us consent to share your information with potential researchers who will then contact you directly. And as mentioned, you can always contact us through the FirstLink Dementia Helpline, 1-800-936-6033. That's 1-800-936-6033. That's Monday to Friday, 9 to 4, and you'll find people to answer all of your questions about dementia, about living with dementia, and you can also find a number of other resources on our website. I encourage you to contact us and to consider further workshops. Thanks for your attention.